The story begins on a beautiful sunny morning as I hum to myself, carefully loading treats into a large picnic basket. This was a day we had eagerly anticipated for weeks, a long-overdue reunion trip with Logan, a childhood friend who had been like family to us. Now, at 21, he had grown into a tall, confident young man, his poise both impressive and a reminder of how much time had passed. How quickly life seemed to move. It was my husband David's idea to organize this trip. He thought it would be a great way for all of us to reconnect and enjoy some much-needed quality time together. Life had been chaotic lately, and this weekend felt like the perfect opportunity to slow down and breathe. We envisioned a day filled with laughter, sweet treats, and exhilarating rides. What I didn't realize was how much this outing would change the way I viewed myself and the people around me. We piled into the car, a mix of excitement and nostalgia filling the air as we embarked on our journey. Logan, sitting in the back seat, was absorbed in his phone but occasionally looked up, offering a warm smile. It caught me off guard with its intensity, but I dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the joy of the day ahead. As we neared the amusement park, the cheerful sounds of children's laughter and the aroma of popcorn greeted us. The day unfolded in a whirlwind of rides, games, and indulgent snacks. It felt like stepping back in time, reminding me of the younger days when Logan used to tag along on family outings, his energy infectious. Now, he led the way, often glancing back to ensure I was keeping up. By midday, David decided to take a break, leaving Logan and me to explore the park together. We wandered through the colorful attractions, eventually making our way to the Ferris wheel, a ride we always saved for last. As the wheel ascended, lifting us high above the bustling park, a sense of calm enveloped me. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world had paused, leaving just the two of us suspended in the sky. "Have you always been this supportive?" Logan's voice was soft, almost hesitant as he gazed out at the horizon. "Of course," I replied with a smile. "That's what friends do." But his expression was serious, layered with emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "It's more than that," he said quietly. "You've been more than just a friend to me. You've been everything." His words caught me off guard, a strange weight pressing on my chest. I forced a laugh, hoping to lighten the moment. "Well, that's what close friends are for," I said lightly, trying to dismiss the intensity. But Logan didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to find something deeper. "You mean more to me than just that," he murmured. His words struck a chord, and I struggled to keep my composure. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice carefully steady. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, as if gathering his thoughts. "I'm not sure how to explain it," he said, his voice barely audible. "But when I'm around you, I feel something I can't ignore." The weight of his confession made my breath catch. This wasn't the conversation I was expecting or ready for. As the ride slowed to a stop, I quickly stood and plastered on a smile. "Let's go find David," I said, my voice tight. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the simple joys of the trip, rides, laughter, shared memories, but something had shifted. Logan's gaze lingered on me longer than I cared to admit, his eyes warm yet unsettling. And the most troubling part? A small part of me didn't want him to look away. "I'm sorry," Logan said softly as we returned to the cabin that evening. His voice carried the weight of guilt. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I quickly wiped a tear from my cheek, trying to gather myself. "It's fine," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Let's just go inside. It's late." The air between us felt heavy with unspoken tension. Though neither of us said anything more, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irreversibly changed. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, painting golden streaks across the room. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous day. It felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake from. David was still sound asleep beside me, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing in my thoughts. I slipped quietly out of bed and headed to the kitchen, hoping the cool morning air and the familiar routine would help clear my mind. As soon as my hand touched the countertop, the emotions from the previous day came rushing back. It wasn't a dream. It was real. I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Logan standing in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Morning," Logan said softly, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile, though I knew it didn't reach my eyes. I turned back to the kitchen counter, pretending to focus on the task at hand. The silence between us was thick, almost tangible. He stepped closer, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling him to stop. "About yesterday," I began, my voice shaky but firm. "Let's not do this. It was a long day. We were both tired and emotional. Let's just leave it in the past, okay?" Logan's gaze didn't falter. His eyes, sharp and searching, seemed to cut through my carefully maintained composure. "Can you really forget it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't." I took a deep breath, gripping the counter for support. "We have to," I said firmly. "It's for the best, Logan." "You say that," he replied, stepping closer, "but I don't think you believe it." Before I could respond, the sound of movement from the bedroom broke the moment. David's footsteps approached, his usual morning cheerfulness in tow. I shot Logan a pointed look, and he reluctantly backed away, retreating into the living room just as David entered. "Morning, honey," David said warmly, wrapping his arms around me. "Morning," I replied, my voice distant but steady. The day dragged on, each moment weighed down by the unspoken tension between Logan and me. David was oblivious, his laughter and light-hearted remarks filling the air. By the time evening arrived, I felt like I was barely holding myself together. When David suggested heading back to the cabin for dinner, I readily agreed, hoping that some quiet time would help me regain control of my emotions. Back at the cabin, I threw myself into preparing dinner, letting the rhythm of chopping and stirring occupy my mind. Logan lingered nearby, his presence uncomfortably close. When our shoulders brushed accidentally, I flinched. "You're avoiding me," he said softly, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "I'm not," I replied, my tone clipped as I avoided his gaze. "You are," he said, his words gentle but persistent. "And I understand. But you know we can't ignore this forever." I set the knife down, my hands trembling slightly. Turning to face him, I said, "We have to." "Logan, this isn't right. We need to move past it." Before he could respond, David called from the living room, his voice breaking the moment. "What's taking so long in there?" he asked with a chuckle. "Dinner's almost ready." I called back, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. Logan stepped away, giving me space, but the weight of his words lingered. The rest of the evening passed in near silence, with only the sound of cutlery and David's easy chatter filling the room. I avoided looking at Logan, terrified of what I might see in his eyes, or what he might see in mine. After dinner, I excused myself, claiming I was tired. As soon as I closed the bedroom door, tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and relentless. I barely had a moment to collect myself before a soft knock at the door startled me. "Please, not now," I thought, but the door opened, and Logan stepped in, his face filled with determination and regret. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and unsteady. I shook my head, my voice trembling. "Logan, no. We don't need to talk about this anymore." But he didn't stop. He moved closer, his expression earnest. "Please," he murmured. "I need you to hear me out. Don't shut me out." I looked at him, my resolve wavering under the weight of his plea. "Logan," I said quietly, my voice strained, "this is too complicated. We can't keep doing this." "I know it's complicated," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But that doesn't change how I feel." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, charged with words we couldn't say. Finally, Logan stepped back, his face etched with a mix of pain and acceptance. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Let's try to move on," I said, though even as the words left my lips, I wasn't sure if I believed them. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Logan," I said softly, trying to hold my ground. "We've already talked about this. It was a moment of vulnerability brought on by everything we've been through lately. He shook his head, stepping closer. It wasn't just a moment, he said firmly. I've never been more certain of anything. You can't just act like it didn't matter. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. This isn't healthy, Logan. We need to find a way to move forward, to focus on what really matters. He exhaled deeply, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. I don't care about what's supposed to matter, he said, his voice trembling slightly. All I know is how much I care about you. About us. His words weighed heavily on me, a confusing mixture of sincerity and longing. I felt like the room was closing in, and yet, some small part of me wanted to believe him. But I couldn't let that happen. I shook my head, trying to steel myself against the rising tide of emotions. No, I said firmly, my voice cracking slightly. We can't. We need to focus on the bigger picture. On what's right for both of us. Logan didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't give him. Finally, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders releasing slightly as he stepped back. The days that followed were strained. The unspoken words between us hung in the air, making every interaction heavy with unacknowledged tension. Logan's glances seemed to carry emotions he couldn't put into words, and every time our eyes met, I felt a wave of guilt and confusion. I tried to focus on the routine of daily life, but it felt like I was simply going through the motions. One quiet evening, I sat on the porch, staring at the stars above. The soft rustling of the trees and the distant chirping of crickets were the only sounds. Logan joined me silently, taking a seat nearby. For a while, neither of us spoke. I know this has been hard, Logan said finally, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. But I don't regret opening up to you. And I can't pretend it didn't mean something. I gripped the armrest of my chair, taking a deep, shaky breath. Logan, I don't know what to say. I'm still trying to make sense of everything. You don't need to say anything, he replied, his voice soft. I just want you to know that I'm here. No matter what. His words struck a chord deep within me. Despite the confusion and the overwhelming emotions, his honesty felt undeniable. But I knew the right thing to do. I stood up, wiping away a tear that had escaped. Logan, I said, my voice trembling slightly, we need to move forward. We need to let go of this and focus on what's best for both of us. Logan stood as well, his expression softening, though his eyes still held a quiet intensity. I understand, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But I don't think I can change how I feel. The days after that conversation were grueling. I tried to act as though everything was fine, but every glance from Logan reminded me of the unspoken tension between us. Each moment felt like a battle between wanting to move forward and the weight of emotions I couldn't name. On the final night of our trip, under the clear expanse of the starry sky, I realized something. This wasn't something we could simply forget. The feelings, the confusion, the guilt, they wouldn't disappear overnight. Logan and I stood side by side in the stillness, the world around us fading into the background. I finally said, my voice barely audible. I can't keep holding on to this. Logan didn't argue. He simply looked at me, his eyes a mixture of pain and understanding. He knew I was right, even if neither of us could fully let go of what had happened. We walked back inside together, but the distance between us had grown. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. The consequences of the choices we'd made, the words we'd left unsaid, they would linger, shaping the way we moved forward. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sounds of the world outside, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Morning, honey, David said brightly, brushing a kiss across my forehead as he passed me in the kitchen. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile. My voice felt tight, the smile strained, as though it were a mask concealing the storm raging inside. I went through the motions of breakfast, but the weight of unspoken words sat heavily on my shoulders. Logan entered a short while later, quietly taking a seat at the table. He didn't speak, but his gaze was distant, filled with emotions I couldn't quite place, regret, longing, and something else I didn't want to acknowledge. I avoided meeting his eyes, The intensity of his presence felt overwhelming. Every glance served as a reminder of the boundary we had unintentionally crossed, and no matter how hard I tried, the memory refused to fade. The day dragged on, each moment filled with tense silence. I focused on mundane tasks, tirelessly working to create distance, to avoid being alone with Logan. Each time our paths crossed, an invisible wall separated us, unspoken yet undeniable. It lingered in the air, shadowing every interaction. By afternoon, we packed up and prepared to leave the cabin. The ride home was somber and quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chatter and laughter we shared. I felt Logan's gaze on me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I was afraid of what I might see, or worse, what I might feel. When we finally arrived home, the familiar surroundings offered no solace. Instead, they seemed to deepen the ache in my heart. I had hoped that being back in our space would bring normalcy, but deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. Nothing would ever be the same. As David unpacked the car, I stood in the doorway, watching him. My mind, however, was elsewhere. Logan entered behind me, his presence palpable. I felt the tension rise as he stood there silently. I waited, expecting him to say something, but he remained quiet. His gaze was steady, unreadable. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged, until he finally turned and walked away. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, as though pulled by an unseen force, I followed him into the living room. Logan stood by the window, his back to me, his posture tense. I stopped in the doorway, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I know I've made things harder, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't just forget it." His words struck like a weight on my chest. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "But we have to move forward. We have to let it go." Logan turned to face me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You can't just tell me to let it go," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "You can't make me ignore how I feel. It's not that simple." I swallowed hard, the ache in my chest almost unbearable. "Logan," I said, my voice shaking, "we can't keep holding on to this. We need to focus on what's best for both of us." His eyes met mine, filled with raw emotion. "I know," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "But I don't know how to change how I feel." I took a step back, my entire body trembling. "You have to," I said, my voice firmer. "For both of us. For our family. You have to." Even as I spoke the words, I knew the truth. They felt hollow. The connection, whatever it was, couldn't simply be erased. It existed, undeniable and persistent, no matter how much I tried to will it away. Logan didn't respond. He stood there, his eyes searching mine, an unspoken understanding passing between us. He didn't need to say anything else. We both knew how deeply things had shifted, how much it had changed us. Finally, I turned and walked back to the kitchen. But the weight of it all, the guilt, the confusion, the unspoken emotions, followed me. It clung to me like a shadow, impossible to escape. I tried to focus on routine tasks, tried to smile and carry on, but it felt like I was going through the motions. As a family, we would continue moving forward, pretending the cracks didn't exist. That's what we always did, carried our burdens silently, burying them beneath the surface. But I knew the truth. The reality would always be there, hovering just out of sight, impossible to forget. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sounds of the world outside, one thought settled over me with painful clarity: nothing would ever be the same.